So let's get started here. There we go. So this is what we're going to talk about today. The first topic is about libraries. The second topic is about lists and variables and lists specifically. And let's get immediately going to the first one. So this is a topic that is actually pretty basic, but at the same time, when I go out and I give training, I can see that not many people make extensive use of libraries, and that's a bit of a pity because it's a very nice concept and something that I use extensively and that I think many people could benefit from more. So I want to introduce what this concept is, and then we're going to look at this in PDF Toolbox as well. I'll show you where to find them, how to work with them, and what the possibilities are. And then, yeah, if there are any other questions about that, we will handle those as well, of course. So let's start with a little bit of terminology here. As you all know or should know, PDF Toolbox relies very heavily on something called profiles, and profiles are collections of checks and fixes. And of course, you can make as many profiles as you want, and most people gather an impressive collection of profiles after some time. There is also something called process plans, and in a process plan you can have profiles, checks, fixes, and then actions, which is another concept, something that changes the document in most cases, something like an imposition action or creating an image and so on. And then on top of that, there are all sorts of support files. Imagine a fix that does convert color. That fix might use an output intent, it might use an ICC profile. Imagine a fix that is called place content. Place content uses HTML templates. A fix that is embed fonts might use a font policy configuration file. Imposition actions will use imposition configs. So if you think about it, there are not only profiles and process plans, but there is a whole list of things that you need to keep track of and that PDF Toolbox keeps track of in some way. And that can cause a few problems, such as, well, if I'm working on a particular project, how do I keep track of the things that are relevant to that project? How do I separate production versions of profiles and so on, and the real and the development version, so the version that isn't complete yet but might be the next generation of what I want to do? How do I transfer stuff from one person to the other? How do I avoid that I end up having 50 copies of everything and not knowing which is which? When I used to give training in PDF Toolbox 8 or before that, I tried to give people ways to work with that. And the most common one was to use a prefix or a suffix in the stuff that you create so that you recognize them. But of course, that had drawbacks, and the solution to that is in the product as of PDF Toolbox 8.5, if I remember correctly, is called libraries. And when you install PDF Toolbox 9, you'll find 5 default libraries, and then you can create as many custom libraries as you want or need, and you can use them for basically whatever you want or need. So it's a pretty flexible thing. Now, instead of going into a lot more theoretical detail, let's close this presentation and take a look at PDF Toolbox. In case you're wondering why I have 3 PDF Toolbox icons here, this is version 8 and version 9. You can install multiple versions. There is actually a Support Vault webinar that in a few weeks from now that is going to take a look at what the issues are when you're doing that. And then this is a version that I will not name yet, but that you might have heard something about. So I can't show you that, but there are things coming up. So let's look at the profile window here in PDF Toolbox. And What I did was I clicked on this little pull down menu here, and actually I closed the switchboard, but I could also open the switchboard window, and you'll see that that has the same pull down menu there. So the collection of libraries is available both from the switchboard and from the profile window. So as you can see, I have a whole bunch of these libraries. The 5 default ones that you should have as well is this device link add-on, essentials, then there is one called PDF standards, prepress color and transparency, and then shapes, variables, JavaScript, and place content. Those are the ones that you will have as well, even if you just did the installation and you never worked with libraries, you will have those. And if I go from one to the other, you'll see that my collection of profiles or my collection of checks and fixes will be different in each of these libraries. The concept of a library is that it is a self-contained, completely independent group of configuration files. And with configuration files, I mean all the things we saw in that presentation slide. So profiles, fix-ups, checks, actions, process plans, imposition config files, font replacement config files, ICC profiles, output intents, all of these things are stored in libraries. And each library has a separate independent collection of these things. Yeah? That means that the things I do in terms of editing to a profile, for example, in my prepress color and transparency library, if I go to another library, will not have any influence on the profiles in that other library. They're completely independent. How do I manage these? Well, the way to do that is also in this list. At the bottom here, you have Manage Libraries, Export and Import. So if I go to Manage Libraries, I'll get a dialog box that shows me the list of all the libraries that I have on my current system. And actually, this dialog is used for much more. You can see on the left-hand side what item I'm looking at, and on the right-hand side, you then have the list of libraries in there. So I have these 5 default ones that I could look at. I also have all of the ones that I created myself. Yeah? At the bottom, I have a way to create a new library, to duplicate an existing one, edit a library, lock it, unlock it, export and import, and then delete. So all of the usual management capabilities. Yeah? Now, I'm going to start this by creating a new library just to show what happens, and we're going to call this support vault library, so that we have something to work with in each of our support vault webinars as we go on. So I'm giving it a name. I can give that a description. You can type whatever you want. You don't really need to give it a description, but sometimes it can come in handy. Related to support vault webinars, we'll call this. And then what is more important is that I can decide what the color of that library is going to be, and I can decide what the initial set of profiles is. Now let's start with that one. If I click this open, you'll see all 5 standard libraries that are installed with pdfToolbox 9. And that means that if at some point I simply want to get a copy of what was in my default library, I can simply create a new library and say, well, initially I want to start that library with everything that normally comes in prepress color and transparency. And that will give me a fresh copy. So if you've ruined a profile somewhere and you want to get it back, or you simply want a copy of one of those default libraries so that you have something to play with, then you can do that. What I'm going to do, and what I do for most projects, and well, actually most of the time when I start a new library, is I'm going to say I want an empty library. An empty one is of course one without profiles, checks, fixes, anything in there. So completely blank slate. And because I want to also have a visual clue about what library I'm working with, I'm also going to tell pdfToolbox to customize the user interface color. And with this you can do whatever you want. I have some preference for purple. I'll do that for now, and we'll give that a white text color. So you can modify the color of the background of some windows, specifically the profile window and also the switchboard window. But you will also see those colors appear in a number of other locations. And you can also modify the color of the foreground text. Okay, so name, description, of course I'm not going to lock it here because I want to work with it. The color of the library in dialog windows, and then as the initial set of profiles, empty. And if I do that, there is a new library that appears in here, and then when I say OK, pdfToolbox will ask me, you've changed one library, which is exactly what we want to do. So I'm going to say OK. This new library is going to be selected by default, and you can see that this this window has now changed to purple. If I would bring up the switchboard, then I would see the same thing there, and the text is now white, and those are the colors that I have selected. Other than that, it is completely empty. Yeah. So this is great. Now I can go to fix-ups and I could create a new fix-up, and when I create a fix-up, that fix-up is always going to be created in the currently active library. So if I now create something in here, my fix-up is going to end up in the support vault library. Now, of course, most of the time you're already going to have things. What if I start a new library for a project, but I know that I have some fixes and checks and maybe some profiles that I'm going to need while I work on that project? Well, let's go back to Manage Libraries for a second. And we get back to our list of libraries with the support vault in that list. But now I'm going to go into one of these other items, and we'll take checks. In there, when I select that, you get two lists on the right-hand side. And for each of these lists, you get to decide which library you're looking at. So let's say that I have something in this pre-flight seminar library that I'm interested in, and maybe it is a check that says detect first page. Now, if I want this one in the project that I'm working on, I simply have to make sure that my project library is selected on the left-hand side, and I can move that check over to the left-hand side. When I say OK, again, I changed a library, and now I have that check available in my support vault library. Now, go back to Manage Libraries. Every other item here works in exactly the same way. So if I have a library with process plans, then I can copy process plans into my library. Or I can copy profiles, checks, fixes, actions, such as the imposition actions and so on that you can make in the switchboard. Also, variables are in here. Variables in pdfToolbox are considered to be separate items, and that means that you can copy them in between libraries just as you copy fixes or profiles or checks. But all of these support files that we talked about in the beginning are also there. So if at some point I created an HTML template for the place content fix-up, then I will find that HTML template in here as well, and I can copy the one that I want over to my library. It's at that point it's not connected to a fix-up, it is only the HTML template that I'm copying, but you can definitely do that. The other option is that you realize that when you copy something, all of the dependent things are copied as well. So I probably have some fix-ups in here for place, no, text. Let me see if I find something in here that makes sense. It probably makes more sense if I go to this one here. So this is a fix-up that uses the place content functionality with an HTML template. Now, if I copy this fix-up into my support fold library, then the HTML template that is needed by that fix-up will also be copied into my new library. Yeah? So dependent information is always copied with the main item that I copy. The same goes for profiles. If I copy a profile, and let's take a complex one, I have here, I can take a PDFX1A profile, or I have all these Gantt workgroup based profiles. If I take this profile and I copy it to my support fold library, then all of the checks and fixes that are inside of this profile are going to be copied into my support fold library. So you never have to go hunt for individual pieces. If you copy something, then everything that depends on that item will also be copied over. So that's actually very, very simple. One other item is I said in the beginning that these things are completely independent. So if I take something here, and I will only take a fix-up as an example. So if I take something here and I copy that over to here, then I now have two independent items. If I start editing this fix-up in this particular library, then I am not modifying the original fix-up in the prepress color and transparency library. So if you want to avoid to modify the default fixes and checks and profiles and so on that are delivered with pdfToolbox, the best way to do that is to simply create a new library, and before you modify anything, just copy items into that new library. And by doing that, you'll have a library where you can edit whatever you want and do whatever you want, delete whatever you want, but you will never modify the original items shipped with pdfToolbox. Of course, you could also use duplicate profile in the original library, but that's always a little bit more dangerous because profiles contains these checks and fixes, and if you change a check, you have to be careful where it is used and so on. If you create your own library and you copy the stuff that you're interested in there first, and then you start working with that library and the fix-ups and profiles and checks in that library, then you're never going to have an issue with that. Okay. One other point, perhaps. This library system solves a really big problem. The fact that whenever you have a project, you need a way to maintain these things and separate them from other things that you're working on. So it's a great concept. Unfortunately, introducing libraries also caused a problem. And I can try to illustrate that. I will go to my, let's say, pre-flight seminar here, and I could say, okay, I have a check somewhere, and I think it is detect first page. And I'm lucky, I find that particular check. Now, I also think I have a check that is called detect second page. But it's not in this library. Oh, maybe it's in this VIP event library. So the fact that you now have multiple libraries gives you a way to lose track of things as well. So sometimes it might actually become more difficult to find things. If that happens, remember this little button here in the profile window. That button is Search All Libraries, and when you click it, you will see a list that contains all checks in this case, or if I go to profiles, all profiles, same for fix-ups. But now they are alphabetically arranged here by name, and there is an indication of what library they are in. So if I now start looking for detect something, I was actually looking in checks for that, detect second. See, now I know I don't have one in here. Yeah? So if I search for page, I will find everything that has to do with page. But it shows me all of the different items that contain page. You have a check here that is called page is odd in prepress color and transparency. I have another one in my support library. I have another one in shapes, variables, JavaScript, and place content. So this button is a great way to search through the complete library, or rather your complete collection of libraries, and find that particular item that you are working with. Yeah. Let's take that one step further. There is also here an option called Search Libraries, and that will actually bring up a dialog box where you can select a library and then search for items in there as well. And this too can search for multiple libraries in here, but you can also specify which types of things you want to check. You can limit that to things that use variables. You can limit it to favorites, so the ones that you have actually favored with this little flag that you have at the end. You can search for things that appear in the workspace, which is the switchboard category called workspace. So this window to search in your libraries allows you an even more fine-grained search through all of the libraries that you have created. In most cases, however, simply being able to say, show me everything in all libraries, and then being able to filter on something will be more than sufficient. For example, these are all of the pdfX1a profiles that I have on my system in pdfToolbox 9. And this shows me all the libraries that they occur in as well. Now, if I make a library and I am fed up with it, and the best example is probably the support library, because I know that every time I give support or I get questions from someone and I have to work on what they give me, every time that happens, I put these things in my support library. That means that when it becomes a bit of a mess because I've been using it for too long, I can simply remove the support library and start over with an empty one. It's a very handy concept to have a temporary location where you can try stuff and so on. What is important in this concept is that, and let me, well, it actually doesn't really matter which one, but let me export a profile for a second. So export profile, and that's going to become, as you know, a KFPX document on my system. When I take that KFPX file and I drag it on top of the main pdfToolbox window, that is the same as importing it into pdfToolbox. Yeah? When I do that, pdfToolbox will always import a profile or multiple profiles, because I can also drag and drop multiple items. It will always import them into the active library. So if you want to import something in a specific library, make sure that that library is selected. In my case, I have the support library selected. Make sure it is selected, and only then go and grab your profile and put it in that library. Yeah? Imports always happen into the selected library. One other point. In some cases, and let me see if I can find an easy example of that. I think scale will, no, scale does not. Rotate does it then, yes. So I can make a fix-up that is going to rotate pages. I can specify how I want to rotate them, and then I can also specify for which pages. And this is done with a pre-flight check. This list that you're looking at right now is the list of relevant pre-flight checks in the active library. One of the questions we get once in a while is, I'm trying to make a fix-up. I open up this list of pre-flight checks for this apply to feature, and the check that I want isn't there. And in many cases, that is because you're actually working in the wrong library. So again, if you want to use a check inside of a fix-up, you have to make sure that the check is going to be in the same library as the fix-up that you're creating, or you're simply not going to see it in the list of checks. Same for ICC profiles, same for output intents. All of these dependent things are of course only going to be available when you're in the correct library. And if they're in a different library, you will have to go into manage libraries and you will have to copy them from one library to the other before you create that fix or check that is going to use them. Last point about libraries, I think, is that you can import and export a library as a whole. And of course, you probably all know that you can import and export profiles, and those become KFPX documents, as you saw. If I go to my support vault library, I can now say export, and that will create a KFPL file. And that KFPL file that I have here contains everything that is inside that library. Yeah? And I can simply give that to someone else. They can import it and they will have an identical copy of all of the profiles, checks, fixes, and all of these other support documents that I had on my system. So if you're working on a project and you want to share that with a customer or with a colleague or and so on, then you can simply export that library, give it to them, and they'll have an identical copy. If you work in a situation where you have a development library and at some point you want to transport it from a test machine to a production machine, for example, same thing. Export that library, import it on the other side, and you're sure that those two machines have an identical setup as long as you're working in that library. Okay, if there are any questions about that, feel free to ask, but I think that's all I wanted to share from a theoretical point of view. So let's go back here and see what we have in the second topic. That should be a little bit shorter, I hope, looking at the time. Second topic is different and talks about variables, and it talks about a specific type of variable. So if we go back to terminology for a second, pdfToolbox has something that is called variables. That's a concept that was invented long ago, if I remember correctly, in pdfToolbox 5 or 6. So that's quite a few years by now. And as of pdfToolbox 9, there are two types of variables: simple variables and JavaScript variables. Simple variables are the ones that were available since pdfToolbox 5, and a simple variable is something that I can put into a parameter of a check or fix. When I run them in pdfToolbox desktop, pdfToolbox desktop will ask the user what the value should be that is used for that variable. They can have a default value that is used when the user simply says go. But they get a chance to modify what that is going to be. Very short example, I could make something that converts spot color, but the actual name of the spot color that is going to be converted could be a variable, so that each time a user runs that particular fix-up or profile, they are asked which spot color do you want to work with this time. They can type in something new, or they can simply accept what was there already. What is much less known, and it's much less known because it is something that wasn't in the original concept, what was added, I believe, in pdfToolbox 9, is that those variables, those simple variables, can also help the user in making the right choice. And that sounds very, very, very theoretical. So let me go back to pdfToolbox and see, I'm going to try and keep my library a little bit neat here, and we're going to this one can stay. We're going to make a new fix-up here, and as a fix-up I'm going to use one that is maybe not so well known either, and that is the fix-up called convert page content into image. What this one does, as you can guess from the name, is it will take the pages in a PDF document and it will convert each page into a single image. So it basically rasterizes everything on the page into a single image. Well, everything on the page, but not necessarily every page. You have this apply to, which would let me say, for example, only take the first page of the document, and in this case only the first page of the document would be rasterized. So, but it rasterizes everything into a into an image. So I could call this rasterize all pages into an image, and when I say OK, I have an action that does exactly that. And if I have a PDF document and I run that, pdfToolbox is immediately going to ask me, where do you want to save the resulting file? And then it's going to do the job. Okay? Now, assume for a second that there are two uses that we have for this, and that depending on the use, we might want to give a different, we might want to use a different resolution in these pages. If I have them online, if they're for online use, then maybe 150 dpi is good enough. If I want to use this in a production workflow because there is a problem with this PDF and rasterization would fix it, then perhaps I want to use 300 or 600 or whatever resolution, higher resolution that I want there. That was the wrong key that I pressed, my apologies. So I have different uses for this, and I don't want to create multiple fixes, so I'm going to create a variable. Remember that we're working in a new library, and in this new library we haven't created variables before, and I also haven't copied anything from another library. So my list of variables in here is empty. And I have two options, new variable or new script. It's a little bit misguided in terms of user interface. Both of these will actually create a variable. The first one will create a simple variable. The second one will create a JavaScript variable. Yeah? So what we want here is a new variable. Okay, this is the dialog box that we get. And I'm going to do the simple stuff first. I'm going to call this var image resolution. And I could make it even more specific and say image resolution for rasterization. And then this is the label we're going to see. And I have a default value of 300. Fine. Let's make this variable. I can see that we now have a variable in here. The angular brackets that you have here show that it's a simple variable. If it was a JavaScript variable, you would have curly brackets. So this is a simple variable. Let's see what happens. If I run this now, it asks me what is the resolution that you want to use. If I say okay, a 300 DPI resolution will be used, but I can now say no, I want 150, or maybe I want 72, or maybe I want whatever you want to rasterize this document as. Yeah, so this should be relatively familiar still. You have the simple variable. At runtime, pdfToolbox is going to ask you what the value is that you want to use for that particular variable. And then when you say OK, that value is going to be used in the fix-up. Let's take this one step further. What if I make a fix-up, but I somehow want to restrict what the values are that people can use? And we all know why. It might make sense to do 150, it might make sense to do 300, but it might not make sense to do anything outside of that range. So, okay, we can do that. I'm going to go to, and let me do this again because this is also something that people very often wonder about how this exactly works. If you click on this orange triangle here, then you basically get an interface that lets you create, again, a new simple variable, a new script. It will show you the list of variables that live in this library, so I can, instead of using the image resolution variable, I could select any other one. But it also gives me options to edit that variable again or to duplicate it. Yeah. So what I'm doing now is clicking on there and saying edit. So instead of making a new variable, I'm simply editing what I already created before. And I'm not going to change anything here. I'm actually going to say limit input values to specific values. And the first thing I'm going to do is use range. And range can be useful sometimes. So I could say 150 and 300. Now let's show you what happens in that case. Nothing changes here. The way this is shown is exactly the same. But when I now say fix, as long as I say 300 here or 250 or anything that is inside of that range, I'm fine. As soon as I have something that is outside of this range, I had nothing, now I have 26. You can see this red cross appearing here, and it will tell me 26 is out of range. Yeah? If I add a 0, it is in the range of 150 to 300, and I get a green check mark because everything is okay. When the variable is out of range, I cannot click OK. So this is essentially a way to force people to use a value for this variable that is in a particular range. I cannot run this fix-up with any resolution value outside of the range 150 to 300. As you'll notice, it's an inclusive range, meaning the endpoints of the range that I define here are included in the valid values. If I specify 150 to 300, which is what we did here, let me go back. If I specify 150 to 300, then those two values are also valid. Okay. Of course, you have to make sure that if your valid range is 150 to 300, that the default value that you provide here is also in that range, or otherwise you're going to create a very strange situation that you are going to allow the user to run this fix-up, and he's immediately going to get something that doesn't work because this 400 value is outside of the range of acceptable values. So that you have to be a little bit careful about. Yeah. Let me restore this. So this is a range. and forcing whatever the user enters to be within this range. But of course, that doesn't always work. I don't want to give someone the ability to rasterize at 171.8 dpi. That doesn't make any sense. I would much rather give them the ability to say, okay, we'll give you options. So out of experience, I know that 72 can sometimes be acceptable, and maybe 96 is also acceptable. And then we're going to do 150, because that seems to be a pretty good compromise between Mac and Windows. And we're going to do 300 and 600. So if I now run this, we've modified our fix-up again, and let me run that. And what you'll see now is that instead of an edit field that appears here, I now have a list, and the only thing that I can select is items from that list. So of course I can't get a red cross anymore, because there is no way I can enter a value that doesn't make sense. The only thing I can do is select the values that someone has prepared for me ahead of time. Yeah. So that's what I wanted to share about that. It's a very simple topic, but it's a topic where that can actually make things a lot more user-friendly if you're building more complex profiles or process plans, and where you can build in lists of ranges to do a little bit of checking already on what is acceptable in variable values and so on. Of course, this is a concept that can probably be expanded, and where you could come up with other ideas in terms of the checking that you want to do and so on. But this is a first step in that direction that was implemented in pdfToolbox 9. As always, if you have things where you think, oh, in the project that I'm working on, it would be really great if this additional thing would work, then please let us know. You should know that feature requests are actually taken into account quite seriously. But if you don't tell us, we can't know. So simply go to our website and use the support form, or send a mail to support@calasoftware.com or support@4ps.com, and those things will end up on a feature request list. Okay. Let me go back to my presentation and do a quick recap. If you have questions about this stuff, although I think it was pretty simple material for our first webinar, we have to start slowly and get you used to this again. But if you have questions, now would be a very good time to enter them in the GoToWebinar control panel. Meanwhile, we talked about libraries and the advantages that libraries can have. Don't forget about this cross-library search button that you have on the profile window. That's actually very, very useful if you don't remember what project you did a particular check or fix for, so don't forget about that one. Just remember that libraries can be used to create independent collections of profiles, process plans, and everything else in pdfToolbox that is a configuration file or a support file in some way. And that these collections, these libraries, can then be exported, given to someone else, imported. Of course, there is no difference between platforms for libraries either, so you can export them on a Mac and import them on Windows. And of course, the same rules for compatibility hold when you're thinking about multiple versions. So if you create a library in version 9 and you would try to import it in version 8, don't expect that that's going to work. In the other direction, there should be forwards compatibility, so that should not be an issue. So that was the first topic, libraries. And then the second topic, we talked about variables, simple variables in this case, where in pdfToolbox desktop, you can modify the default simple edit field editing that you have for the values of these variables, and you can either implement a range that is considered to be valid for a particular variable, with pdfToolbox doing range checking and only allowing the fixup to be run if the value that is supplied by the user is inside of that valid range. And we also looked at the list capability, where you can enter list values and you can then use or allow the user to select only values in that list. Okay. Meanwhile, I'm also going to put up the last slide here that has my email address on it as well. If there is something specific you want to ask about this webinar, don't hesitate to send me an email and I'll get back to you.